Now, welcome folks to the fourth and the last part or episode of Chapter 9. We've been talking about the skeletal muscles, and we have not really mentioned anything about the smooth and cardiac muscle, and this is when we'll be talking about them. So smooth muscles, when we compare them to skeletal muscles, they are much shorter. You can see here that they are more elongated. The cells are more elongated than your skeletal muscles are. They're kind of tapered at the end. The myofilaments are very randomly organized. So the actin and myosin are not really in that parallel perfect position as we've seen in skeletal muscles. And that's why smooth muscles are not striated. So they lack the striations. They do have actin and myosin, but they're not perfectly organized. And that is why, again, we don't see striations. They don't have a transverse tubule. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is not very well developed. It still needs calcium for contractions, but the SR of smooth muscles are not as well developed as we have them in the skeletal muscles. There are two different kinds of smooth muscle fibers. They're either multi-unit or visceral. The multi-unit ones, you want to think of the smooth muscles of the eye and the iris of the eye, or the smooth muscles that are found in the walls of blood vessels. These cells pretty much act as individual cells, okay? They do not communicate together to perform a function. They function as separate units, totally independent of each other. They are stimulated by nerves and by hormones. So when we talked about skeletal muscles need a stimulus coming from, or in order to contract, coming from a nerve. They do not contract by orders coming from hormones. Smooth muscles, though, on the other hand, they can contract or respond to orders coming from neurons or hormones. Now, to the visceral smooth muscle fibers, these are the ones that you would find, say, in hollow organs like the urinary bladder, the stomach, small and large intestine, and so on. These, though, do respond as a unit. Okay, and they exhibit what is known as rhythmicity. So it's more of a peristaltic, wavy kind of movement that occurs. We'll take the small intestine as a good example of that, where the muscle fibers have to work together and in sync so that one part is contracted, another part is relaxed, and you could give you that wave movement in order to push the contents through the digestive system. They are all connected together through gap junctions, and you will find gap junctions in between cells that need that fast communication. Okay, and this visceral smooth muscle fibers are what the majority of our smooth muscle fibers are. So these multi-unit ones are the minority, and again, you'll think about the iris of the eye and the blood vessels or the walls of the blood vessels. For smooth muscle contraction, there are things that smooth muscles have in common with skeletal muscle. And that is that there is an interaction between actin and myosin. Okay, we do use calcium and ATP, and they are triggered by membrane impulses. So by change in the electricity across the cell membrane. But they do differ in a lot of other things. So the smooth muscle fibers do not have troponin. Instead, they have something called calmodulin. And calmodulin is related to, because it is modulated by calcium. Okay, so calmodulin replaces troponin in smooth muscle fibers. Remember when we talked about skeletal muscles, we said that it responds to acetylcholine. Smooth muscles respond to acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Hormones can stimulate or inhibit smooth muscle fibers. So you will see, for example, norepinephrine can stimulate maybe the bronchial muscles, the muscles of the lung, while it would inhibit the muscles of the small intestine. So that same hormone can either stimulate or inhibit depending on where that muscle is. If you stretch a smooth muscle, that can lead to a contraction. So when the contents pass through the small intestine, just the fact that we've stretched the small intestine, that triggers a contraction. Smooth muscles are very slow in their contraction and their relaxation. And that, again, goes back to the fact that the actin and myosin are not organized whatsoever. So the contractions and relaxations happen, but they're much slower. And due to the fact that they're slower, they are more resistant to fatigue. So you don't get at a point in time where, like I've gone to the bathroom so many times where, okay, my intestines are just tired. I cannot do this anymore. Okay, so that might be something that would happen if you over-exercise. That can happen to your skeletal muscles. You can get fatigued. But fatigue is not something that would happen to smooth muscles as easily. Smooth muscles can change length without changing tautness. And that means that you could stretch a smooth muscle, okay, but you want to kind of think of it as a balloon. You could stretch it without leading to a contraction. So our bladders, for example, can stretch and fill up with urine, and you might feel that urge to go to the bathroom, but if you wait for a couple of minutes, that urge disappears. Okay, so you've stretched, you change the length of the smooth muscles of the bladder, but you did trigger the contraction, so you did feel the urge to empty your bladder. But after a while, we are going to go back to relaxing the muscles. So we eventually didn't change the tautness or the strength of the contraction or the force that is coming out of that muscle. Cardiac muscle fibers, the only place you will find them would be in the heart, and that's where the name comes from. These are striated muscles, so you do have that very nice parallel actin and myosin. The muscle fibers are uninucleated, so it has one nuclei, and they have what are known as intercalated discs in between the muscle fibers. So muscle cells join each other through these intercalated discs, and these discs are full of gap junctions. Again, whenever you need something to contract as a unit, you'll have these gap junctions so that the communication can happen faster, and you want the heart to contract as a unit. The unit of the heart is known as the syncytium, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail when we get to the cardiac chapter. The branches of the cardiac muscles, or the cells of the cardiac muscles do branch. They have what is known as self-excitation and rhythmicity. So again, the cardiac muscles contract rhythmically, and they have the ability to self-excite themselves. Like they don't even need an order from a nerve or a hormone to contract. They have their own pacemakers, the SA node, which can lead to a contraction, regardless if there is a nerve or an order coming from a nerve or not. They have longer refractory periods, and that is in order to protect the ventricles. And again, we'll talk about how that works when we get to the cardiovascular system. There is no sustained or tetanic contraction. So remember we said that in the skeletal muscle, we have what we have called a sustained or a tetanic contraction. That does not occur in the cardiac muscle. So you don't really have that summation. The whole muscle contracts as a whole and then relaxes. There's no summation into either a sustained or tetanic contraction. And that again is protective to the cardiac muscle fibers. So tetanus would affect skeletal muscles, but not the cardiac muscles. Now here this is a table that compares and contrasts all three different kinds of muscle fibers. Nothing new here that we have not already discussed. Now, what are the lifespan changes of this system? So starting at the age of 40, myoglobin, which again is the protein that stores oxygen. So myoglobin, ATP, and creatine phosphate, all of those tend to decline. Muscle tissue starts to decline as well, so it becomes atrophic and replaced by connective tissue and adipose cells. By the age of 80, about half of the muscle mass has become atrophic. Muscle strength tends to decrease. Reflexes become slower, so there's that interaction between muscle and nerve where the reflexes get slower, and hence the need to always evaluate patients. If they get to a point where the reflexes are too slow, are they a hazard to themselves when they're driving? Are they a hazard to others? These are things that you have to keep in mind. So exercise will definitely help in maintaining that muscle mass and muscle function. So that's something that you would want to, again, explain to your patients, that in order to prevent, or even in some cases reverse, the atrophy that occurred, you want to encourage them to exercise. And this ends chapter 9.